So there are basically 4 prime ministers in Canadian history who are considered like the really important ones: John A. Macdonald, Wilfrid Laurier, Robert Borden, and William Lyon Mackenzie King. You can tell they're important because they're on the money. And today we are going to talk about Mr. $50 bill himself, Mackenzie King. A lot of Mackenzie King's importance comes from the fact that he ran Canada for such a long period of time. He served 6 terms between 1921 and 1948 for a total of 21 years in power. To this day, that is still among the all-time records of any democratically elected leader. Anyway, because King ran Canada for such a long period of time, it is difficult to sum up everything he did in just a short video. So for the purposes of this one, I mostly just want to focus on what I consider to be the most important part of his legacy, which is to say his role in securing Canada complete political independence from Great Britain. But just a quick reminder before I begin, today's video was brought to you by our friends at Skillshare. We will talk more about them in a bit. So, William Lyon Mackenzie King was from Ontario. He got his weird name from his grandfather, who had been an important Canadian politician too. As a young man, Mackenzie King was a respected social scientist who had earned degrees in some of the top universities in America. In the early 20th century, he was recruited to serve in the cabinet of Canada's famous Liberal Prime Minister, Wilfrid Laurier. Laurier was then voted out of office in 1911, and in 1919, Mackenzie King was made the new head of the Canadian Liberal Party. Now, what was Canadian politics like in those days? Well, one issue that was becoming increasingly top of mind was Canada's status as a British colony. Over the course of the 19th century, the British had established the biggest empire the world had ever known, with colonies in dozens of countries all over the planet. This included many countries that Britain had simply conquered, along with what were known as the settler colonies. The settler colonies were basically brand new countries that Britain had invented for the benefit of white European settlers. Canada was the largest of these. America used to be the largest, but of course that didn't work out. But in fairness, the British had learned some important lessons in the aftermath of the American Revolution. The main one being that as a settler colony grew larger and more prosperous, it would expect to have a high degree of control over its own internal affairs. And this was basically what happened in Canada. By the early 20th century, Canada had become this large, wealthy, industrialized place with big cities and factories and its own democratically elected government and all the rest. Some said it had become almost as advanced as Britain itself. In fact, some said it was an even better country than Britain itself. Fewer orphans, for instance. For a long time, there had been this idea that Canada would forever be satisfied being a good little loyal subject of Britain, a place that could derive all of its patriotic pride from, the reflected glories of the empire. But by the 1920s, this was really starting to wear off. As Canada grew in size and wealth, Canadians just weren't as wowed by Britain as they used to be. Certainly all of the increasingly lame politicians running Britain didn't seem that impressive anymore. And thus, Canada's leaders began to openly question the powers these politicians had over their country. Even though on a day-to-day basis, Canada functioned as a fully self-governing democracy, in theory, if Britain wanted to, they could still overrule the decisions of the Canadian government, so that made people a little bit anxious. In particular, there was growing anxiety over the fact that Britain seemed to enjoy using its settler colonies as tools in its foreign policy. During the early 1900s, thousands of Canadians were asked to fight and die to preserve British interests in 2 big wars. First, there was the 1899-1902 Boer War to quell a Dutch settler revolt in South Africa. And then came World War I, where 68,000 Canadians died fighting Britain's European enemies. Is this what Canada was for? William Lyon Mackenzie King was elected Prime Minister of Canada in 1921. Because of the First World War and a worsening economic situation in many parts of the country, particularly Western Canada, the Conservative government had grown very unpopular and was kicked out in a massive landslide. The new parliament was dominated by Mackenzie King's Liberals, as well as a bunch of new progressive parties devoted to economic and social reform. This meant that to get anything done, King had to do a lot of political wheeling and dealing. Here, let's watch this quick video from the Historica Canada Foundation that basically sums up what Canadian politics was like in those days.
I said it in the House and I say it now. Is it too much to ask?
My party does not have a majority in the Commons, Mr. Woodsworth, unless I have the support.
Is it too much to ask that Canada take care of poor people, 70 years of age, who built this country?
Well, you and Mr. Heaps are the Labour Party. You hold the balance of power. Perhaps in a coalition, I'm offering you a seat in cabinet, Mr. Woodsworth.
I'm on it, sir. But no.
Mr. Heaps, be my Minister of Labor?
Mr. King, I can't do that. But the Labour Party would support you on old age pensions.
In that case, it's not too much to ask, Prime Minister.
A lot of Mackenzie King's first term was dominated by those sorts of debates over the creation of new social programs, which isn't really the focus of this video, so we won't get into too much detail about that. But what's interesting for our purposes is how those debates wound up indirectly causing one of the single biggest spats between Canada and the UK. King ran for re-election in 1925, and the Parliament came back even more divided. After a few more months of wheeling and dealing, King decided that he had gotten tired of running the country this way. He said there should be another election, even though it had not even been a year since the last one. That was already a pretty dramatic request, but get this. In those days, final say on when Canadian elections could be held was up to Britain. Specifically, it was up to the British-appointed Governor of Canada, who in this case was a former British Army general named Lord Julian Hedworth George Byng, 1st Baron of Vimy, and Lord Byng said no to Mackenzie King. He said that if Mackenzie King was finding it too hard to run the country, well, he would find someone else who could. So on June 28th, 1926, Lord Byng appointed former Conservative Prime Minister Arthur Mahan, the man who Mackenzie King had beat in the 1921 election, back to power. And yeah, that lasted all of 3 days, because of course King's party and his allies, who together held a majority of seats in the Canadian Parliament, immediately voted non-confidence in this unelected Prime Minister. Only then did Lord Byng agree to hold the election. In the ensuing campaign, King demagogued very hard that Canada was a mature country that did not deserve to be subjected to these condescending colonial shenanigans from Britain anymore. Let me read you a passage from this book, Fights of Our Lives, Elections, Leadership, and the Making of Canada. For the first time, King found his true political voice, attacking with the bravura of a supple-minded man who for once believes himself to be on the right side of a clear-cut moral situation. In contrast to his usually cool, analytical approach to most issues, the Liberal leader saw Mahan's ascension as a matter of liberty versus tyranny. The royal colonial power was imposing a big business imperialist puppet on the people of Canada without an election. And it worked! King won a third term by a big margin. Shortly after King was re-elected, the British hosted a big summit in London of all of the prime ministers of all of the white settler colonies with the goal of restructuring the empire. Canada was not the only country that was frustrated with the way the British were running things. Ireland and white-ruled South Africa were getting pretty uppity as well, so there was a lot of momentum for reform. And in return, Britain was willing to grant some concessions. For one, they agreed to turn the governors of the white colonies into basically what they are now, which is powerless figureheads. Britain also agreed that the settler countries should be recognized as autonomous communities within the British Empire, as opposed to straight-up colonies like, say, India. But other than that, Britain's conservative government was not interested in conceding too much. In particular, they had not conceded the thing that King considered the most important, which was the right of the colonies to make independent foreign policy decisions. So when King got back to Canada, he decided to just do his own foreign policy stuff anyway, basically calling Britain's bluff. He created an independent Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and started appointing independent Canadian ambassadors to big important countries like America and France and Japan. Canada similarly began signing treaties with countries regardless of whether Britain approved or not, and for that matter, ignoring treaties that Britain had signed but King decided were not in the best interests of Canada. In 1927, he even got Canada elected to the Security Council of the League of Nations, which was the UN of those days. So in 1929, Britain hosted another summit of the white settler colonies, which were by now calling themselves the Commonwealth of Nations in order to distinguish themselves as something distinct within the empire. By this point, King's people were pushing really hard for maximum independence, and they weren't really facing much opposition anymore. Britain was now run by the Socialist Labour Party for the first time, which was very much in favor of loosening up the empire. The negotiations went on for months, but in the end, they agreed on the following. Britain would surrender all power to pass laws for Canada. Britain would no longer control Canadian foreign policy or military policy. Britain would no longer speak for Canada in any context, nor consider Canada its colonial possession. There were only a couple of exceptions. Canada would still regard the British king or queen as its ceremonial leader. Canada would still retain a symbolic British governor-general representing that king or queen. And perhaps most importantly, the Canadian Constitution could still only be changed by a vote of the British Parliament. We shouldn't overstate the significance of that last part, though. Britain probably would have given Canada the ability to change its constitution if it wanted, But at that time, there was still a lot of internal political debate in Canada as to what a better system of amending Canada's constitution would be. A lot of politicians wanted Canada to have a system for changing its constitution that was like what they had in America, where a certain amount of states have to agree to constitutional amendments, but nobody could really seem to agree on what the good number would be. And as a result, Canada did not get this sorted out until the 1980s. In any case, King had secured for Canada something extraordinarily important: political independence from its former colonial master. British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald would later enshrine all of these promises into a big piece of legislation known as the Statute of Westminster, which has been called the Canadian Declaration of Independence. But back in Canada, other issues quickly overshadowed this achievement. 1929 was also the year that the Great Depression struck, causing millions of Canadians to lose their jobs. And just a few months after the Imperial Conference, Mackenzie King lost his bid for a fourth term as Prime Minister to the head of the Conservatives, R.B. Bennett. Bennett would proceed to run Canada for the next 5 years, causing an interruption in King's long term of office. So, King was elected back to power in a big landslide in 1935. Turns out old man Bennett wasn't that much better at dealing with the Depression than King was. By this time, events in Europe were starting to consume everyone's attention, and Mackenzie King thought that this would be a good opportunity for newly independent Canada to make its first confident steps into the international foreign policy scene. Unfortunately, the issue that King chose to make Canada's first great cause was appeasement of Nazi Germany. Today, King is usually considered to have been embarrassingly naive when it came to the Nazis, probably one of the single most delusional leaders of any Western country. In 1937, Prime Minister King went to Germany to visit with Hitler and was totally impressed. He thought Hitler was a great guy and totally bought into the Nazi perspective on the situation in Europe. As he put it in his diary, he is really one who truly loves his fellow man. Now, part of the reason that King might have liked Hitler was because that King, like much of the Canadian establishment of that time, was very anti-Semitic. King's immigration department in particular has a very dark legacy of hostility to Jewish refugees who were trying to flee Nazi Germany. Throughout the Nazi era, Canada was actually the single least welcoming Western nation to Jewish refugees. And at that time, that was something that a lot of Canadians would have considered something to be proud of. Anyway, when the Second World War finally broke out, it is safe to say that King was caught a little bit off guard. He had been in a lot of denial that Hitler presented any threat to anyone, but, even he couldn't escape reality forever. King had initially hoped to keep Canada neutral, but after Great Britain declared war on Nazi Germany in 1939, he felt that Canada's historic alliance with Great Britain obligated Canada to declare war as well. Now, Canada's role in the Second World War is a huge topic that deserves its own video. For our purposes, the main thing to know is that Canada was a firm member of the Allies, and that hundreds and thousands of Canadian soldiers fought bravely in Europe and the Pacific. This was the first war that Canada fought as an independent country.
Canada's war effort is a voluntary effort. It is the free expression of a free people. Like the other nations of the Commonwealth at war today, we entered the war of our own free will, and not as the result of any formal obligation.
Though that didn't wind up being that relevant because, of course, all of the major strategic decisions were just made by Britain and America anyway. Most historians agree that King really vindicated himself during the war after his pro-Hitler past. King became very close with President Roosevelt in America and Prime Minister Churchill in Great Britain, and his wartime leadership really helped solidify the bonds that unite these three countries in a very special relationship. Internally, however, the war did spawn a lot of controversies within Canada. After Canada declared war on Japan in 1941, there was tremendous racism directed to Canadians of Japanese heritage. King's government approved policies that stripped them of their property and sent them to internment camps in rural British Columbia. The war was also deeply unpopular in Quebec because, and this is still a very touchy subject today, a lot of French Canadians were pro-fascist. So there was a great deal of pressure for King's government to impose some sort of draft on the French Canadians to force them to fight in the war, and this became one of the defining controversies of the conflict. Someday I will do a full video on Canada and World War II, and we can get into all of these issues in greater detail. But anyway, eventually the war ended, and Mackenzie King was still in power. In fact, I believe he was the only leader other than Stalin who was in power at the beginning of the war and still in power once the war was over. His last 3 years in office were spent mostly continuing to consolidate Canada's identity as an independent country, with Canada joining the United Nations and all of the other international organizations that sprung up after the war to build a lasting peace. World War II was also basically the final nail in the coffin of the British Empire, and the Commonwealth kind of quickly shriveled into irrelevance as well. In 1947, independent Canadian citizenship was created for the very first time, with Mackenzie King becoming the very first citizen of Canada. The last thing King did before leaving office was help persuade the nation of Newfoundland, which was this weird little country on the eastern coast of North America, to join Canada. And in July of 1948, they voted to do that, and a few months later, King finally retired from politics. What had been a mere colony of Great Britain when he first took office in 1921 was now destined to be one of the major industrialized Western powers of the second half of the 20th century. Now, I cannot, in good conscience, make a video about Mackenzie King without talking at least a little bit about his bizarre personal life. Indeed, you could easily argue that the main thing Canadians remember about him today, more than the independence of Canada, more than the social programs, more than Hitler, more than the war, is just how weird and eccentric he was. King was extremely superstitious, like almost cripplingly so. Pretty much every decision he made about everything was informed by like dreams and fortune tellers and like astrology and secret codes in the Bible and like shapes he saw in clouds and this sort of thing. This was actually one of the reasons why he got along so well with Hitler, because Hitler was into all this crazy junk too. King was also part of a generation of Victorians that was very into like the occult and black magic type stuff. So he believed you could summon the spirits of the dead and like communicate with people beyond the grave, and he was like into reincarnation and past lives. It just really went on and on. He would famously hold seances to talk to his dead mother and Leonardo da Vinci and like his dead dog, who I think he believed was the reincarnation of someone else. All of this stuff was considered incredibly embarrassing to the government, and his people did their best to hide it from the public. Most of it only really came out long after he died. But, you know, I guess it does say something about the man. A lot of folks would argue that people who have a lot of superstitious beliefs are so fundamentally irrational that they shouldn't be trusted with making important decisions. And yet Canada had Mackenzie King making its decisions for 21 years and it turned out okay. And speaking of things turning out okay, let me tell you a story. So I have a website all about Canada called The Canada Guide, and recently I've been thinking of taking some photographs for it, specifically photos of like Canadian foods and Canadian objects. But the problem is I don't really know that much about photography. So what did I do? Well, I visited my most favorite website, Skillshare. Skillshare is a website full of high quality video tutorials that can teach you how to do just about anything. In my case, I was able to find tons of videos about still life photography and learn lots of useful tips on how to take good photographs of inanimate objects, like the importance of using a light box, or even how the color of shirt you wear can affect the tint of your photo. If you want to learn how to solve your own problems using Skillshare, well, do I have a good deal for you. For 2 months, you can get free access to absolutely everything on the site. All 25,000 plus classes on photography, art, design, cooking, business, and more. Offer extends to the first 500 people who sign up using the link in the thing below. I don't know about you guys, but I've been having a lot of fun making these Canadian Prime Minister videos. Let me know in the comments below which Prime Minister you'd like to see a video on next, or maybe a leader from a country that's not Canada. You know, stranger things have happened. I will see you all next week.